Let's take a pause for the notes. Bell ringer, what did you learn about European supremacy? Typed in the chat. That, of course, refers to yesterday's material. And then, of course, don't forget about the paper topic here, the introduction. Make sure you fill out that doc with your question. You copy and paste that from the previous assignment. And the answer to that is your thesis. And then an introduction paragraph or two, including a purpose statement. I give you an example of both of those things in the document. So today we'll finish talking about this material, specifically the distinct classes, and then some of the interaction between politics and economics. So first, with the distinct classes, this is, of course, referring to the various groups that live within Europe in many different countries, not just in one in particular. So obviously one of those groups are women. So until the latter part of the 19th century, women were not allowed to own property in most of Europe. Britain didn't even change this until 1882. Divorce was difficult to obtain, especially for women. Men had control over their children, and birth control, various forms, was illegal. There's also a lack of secondary and college education for women until the late 19th century. And women who did hold professional jobs were considered radical. But there were new opportunities for women, including secretaries, clerks, other types of assistants. But they had to withdraw from these, of course, when they got married in many cases. And of course, one of the most common forms of work were domestic services, working in other people's homes. But as new technologies increased, then there would be even more jobs with assistants, basically assistant work, that would open up. For instance, the earliest phone systems, you had to have an operator to connect all of your calls. And so women were often hired to work in these kinds of positions.
Plug it into a different wire.
Mm-hmm.
That's the stupidest.
It was necessary, though. And of course, whenever there was the belief that too many women were working, you often had a backlash in the public, portraying working women as lacking femininity. They weren't female enough. And then, of course, one other aspect of women as times changed, as people moved into cities, was the career of prostitution. And many large cities actually allowed it. And then there was middle class women. Yeah, so middle class women, their main goal was to be a mother and wife, making sure that their children received a good religious education, that they contributed to charity. And so, while amongst men, you often saw more political reform called to amongst middle class men, for instance. Amongst middle class women, though, you often saw quite the opposite. In fact, there was little support at first from middle class women when it came to equal rights. They were afraid of upsetting the apple cart, the fact that they had a lot of economic success in their role as wives and mothers in the middle class. They were concerned about disrupting that. But still, there would be a rise in the number of women at least protesting for the right to vote, known as suffrage. Millicent Fawcett, which is spelled Fawcett, Fawcett. She led the moderates, who were more interested in
Who was it?
Millicent Fawcett, which is Fawcett. Fawcett. She led the moderates, and they were generally opposed to any form of violence or disruption. And then Emmeline Pankhurst. Pankhurst is spelled Pankhurst. Emmeline Pankhurst was a more radical person that believed in using strikes and even arson and vandalism.
So a bunch of women beating stuff up.
Yes.
Stupid.
Women would eventually be given the right to vote in Britain in 1918. And in Germany, 1919. But some of these groups were not just concerned with the right to vote, but also things like education and healthcare. But of course, in some cases, their protests were met with resistance and arrests. Some had to resort to hunger strikes in prison to prove their point, but they were then force fed. So it was a long, arduous journey toward
They can't even.
equal rights, yes.
She's so short. Is hanging still allowed then?
Yeah, absolutely.
I should have just died. Oh my.
The
Honestly, not an issue.
next group I will talk about are Jews.
I like these guys.
Jews in Western Europe started to receive a lot of rights by the late 19th century.
The people of like the Jewish people.
Mhm.
Well,
Yep. Started to gain some rights in Western Europe in the late 19th century. But many throughout Europe, especially Eastern Europe, couldn't own land. and had to pay special types of taxes. In Russia, there were limits on the number of books they could publish and where they could live. They're also excluded from universities. And then occasionally, kind of similar to the situation African Americans faced in the South, whenever something bad happened or a crime was committed, there'd be some kind of mob mentality that would sweep through Jewish communities, beating people up, burning houses to the ground. These are commonly known as pogroms, which is spelled P-O-G-R-O-M-S. Huh?
They're literally, I don't count, they're white people.
So how do they know the difference? They,
Yeah, but they're white.
yeah,
I
and
don't get it.
they were still Jewish, though.
But they're white Jews. I mean, that's religion, but like still.
People really hated Jewish people.
What's different about them?
They don't believe in Jesus.
I don't.
They live in separate communities often, read the Hebrew.
It's more mainstream to not believe than to believe.
So things were obviously a lot worse in Eastern Europe. So you would see a migration of Jews from east to west. But despite these improvements, there would still be anti-Semitism, especially in France, and not surprisingly, Germany.
Well, I guess they don't like them there that much.
Yeah. France and Germany. This last topic we'll talk about are economics and politics.
Yeah, I'm not Aryan, so. I'm like 6 foot. I have blue eyes, brown, blonde hair.
Well, yeah, that's more of a propaganda myth. It wasn't true that, all those people had blonde hair. Hitler didn't even have blonde hair.
You like black hair.
Yeah.
Weird.
But you started to see the involvement of unions, which would work to improve conditions and pay. But they often had to take radical action, like engaging in strikes. They and other groups pushed for political parties, their own political parties basically, to try to achieve their agenda in public office. And these political parties would work with the media, especially newspapers, to put out their message. And eventually you would see the development of socialist parties. Depending upon where and who they were, they might want to engage in more radical efforts. British and French people created the First International. And the First International discussed all the problems facing working people. Some of their complaints and interactions would eventually lead to the rise of Marxism. The Fabian Society was in Britain, Fabian, and it was concerned with social equality, but it wasn't a Marxist organization. Seeing the need for change, David Lloyd George in Britain would provide things like, he's a member of Parliament, unemployment benefits and health care. advocate for unemployment benefits and health care. In France, you actually see one of the largest socialist parties, but many other politicians will not work with them. And even though there would be a lot of working people that would vote for the socialists, that would be kind of the limit of their support. In Germany, Bismarck tried to suppress socialism. And there, one of the Europe's oldest political parties, known as the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. Remember, in other languages, they switch the adjective and the noun. So the SPD would be their socialist party, and Bismarck convinces the legislature to pass laws against socialism to stop the SPD from growing. But Bismarck knew that some of their ideas were popular, so he decided to pass laws that would give working class people a reason to vote for his people, his politicians, the conservatives, instead of socialists. So he created things like accident insurance and disability programs, old age programs, because they're considered with all of society. And they want to make a society based inequality.
A society-based inequality.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to make inequality.
Inequality, in space equality, not inequality.
Inequality.
Yes. Some socialists wanted to get rid of capitalism through elections, particularly those engaged in what was called the Erfurt program, which is spelled ERFURT. And the Erfurt program didn't like the idea of using violence or revolutions. They just wanted to use legislation to get rid of capitalism. And often these attempts at trying to end capitalism without violence was known as revisionism. Meanwhile, in Russia, you still didn't have this big growth of socialism yet. That wouldn't happen until a little bit before World War One. In the meantime, though, some leaders of Russia that assisted the Tsar's family did want to try to engage in some type of economic reform. They wanted to build infrastructure and establish protective tariffs. That way, Russian industry could grow without competition from companies from other countries. And you did see some expansion in steel, iron, and textile. And the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, one of the longest rail lines in the world. But of course, none of this really benefited the average peasant, which made up the bulk of the population. And even if there wouldn't be any socialists, you would have liberals in Russia that would be influential in local government that wanted a constitutional monarchy. The first real socialist, though, of prominence in Russia would be Vladimir Lenin. Yes, they do both have the same first name. But Vladimir Lenin was part of Russia's Social Democratic Party. And there was a long debate inside that party of whether or not they should use violence. So eventually, the Social Democratic Party, after this debate over whether or not they should violence, split into two. Lenin led the more radical branch known as the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik. The opposing, more moderate faction were the Mensheviks. Menshevviks. Even though they couldn't agree whether or not violence should be used, they did both agree that the Tsar needed overthrown. The problem is that Russia didn't have a lot of industry, so you didn't have labor unions or a huge working class that was interested in this type of change. And a lot of people were scared of trying to overthrow the Tsar. In 1905, there was a large amount of protest that happened, but the Tsar's troops easily put it down. It was commonly known as Bloody Sunday. The new Tsar Nicholas II put forth a manifesto promising a constitution. Eventually, a legislature known as the Duma, D-U-M-A, would be introduced, but it would have limited power. But the Tsar's new finance minister, Stolypin, which is spelled Stolypin, wanted to suppress the socialists again and execute rebel peasants. And he was eventually assassinated. And once Stolypin was assassinated, the Tsar turns to a new close advisor by the name of Rasputin. And Rasputin really doesn't have a lot of administrative abilities, but he supposedly has the ability to take care of the Tsar's sick child. Now, there's no evidence this Rasputin was involved in how inept Nicholas II became or was suppressing anybody. He was just a weirdo that wanted to stay in power because he was a womanizer.
He didn't like his woman.
He did, even though he was a filthy, filthy man.
Didn't he he was killed? They shot him and threw him over the bridge.
Shot, stabbed, poisoned, thrown over a bridge.
They say that there was a guy who had this eyewitness where there was a man screaming in the water after.
Maybe.
He could have been alive even after.
But anyway, in the meantime, though, this mysterious man being there by the czar's side just created more and more conspiracy theories about what was going on. So those are all the notes for the unit. After you get your comments and summary at the end put in, you can submit that. The rest of the period, make sure you finish up that introduction for your paper. And next week will be a review and test week.